I was recently reading and listening to a lot of news reports about the ongoing Theranos trial. For those that are not familiar with it, Theranos was a Silicon Valley startup that was valued at $10 billion at one point, and it was supposed to create a technology that would make pretty much all the possible lab tests, blood lab tests that you can have with just a tiny bit of blood from your finger, the same way the glucometers for diabetes works. That you wouldn't have to draw many liters of blood to run thousands of tests. You just run those thousands of tests on a single drop, which is at this point entirely unfeasible for our technology, but the CEO of Theranos, Miss Elizabeth Holmes, made that promise and pitched that sort of science fiction technology to a lot of investors, which succeeded. And then she also pitched it to Walgreens, that was supposed to provide the locations where the actual patients would test their blood using this quote unquote miraculous technology. And they were actually being tested. And the problem was that the tests were immensely inaccurate and totally off the charts when it comes to false data, incorrect readings, and they didn't line up with traditional tests at all. You had people who got tested and received fake reports that they had some sort of medical issue. You had people who had real medical issues but that they weren't detected using the Theranos test. And the whole thing pretty much went to hell. There is now, like I said, a criminal trial going on, and by all evidence, Mrs. Holmes is likely to get sentenced. Of course, it was all a giant scam from the very beginning. It was just a scam that convinced a lot of very influential people, including people like Henry Kissinger, who was on the board of Theranos, and Mr. Madoff, who invested $125 million into this scam. But what I wanted to talk about is not about the history of Theranos, it's about Miss Holmes, because I started to watch some of the interviews she made before this whole thing went public and before this information blew up, at the point where she was still pitching her product. And what struck me the most is this sort of self-satisfied smile she had when she was lying, and she could see that the news reporter wasn't contesting the lies that she was making. And the more they weren't asking, the more she smiled. Why was this something I picked up? Well, because I saw the exact same behavior in my past. During my quote-unquote career as an investigator. Going back to Scientology investigations, when you use the e-meter, technically Ron said that a suppressive person, someone who you normally call a psychopath or a sociopath, this is someone who you're going to be able to very clearly detect on the meter. And my experience with it was exactly the opposite. Namely, that if you encounter a psychopath, he or she is gonna lie in a way that will not read on the meter. Why is that? Because, as I mentioned in my previous green tape, the meter detects fear. It's an anxiety detector. That's really the only thing it can detect. And those people who I consider to be sociopaths after investigating deeper, They didn't read, they had absolutely no fear. You get a flat reading from them. I saw instances where I had hard evidence, I had tapes, recordings, testimonies, documents proving that I'm correct and that they're trying to lie and get out of the pickle that they were in. And each time, even if most normal people would be already extremely anxious and extremely disoriented and just saying anything just to get out of that room from that investigation, those hardcore people would keep their calm, absolute calm, and they would just lie without blinking. And the meter would not detect any of it. After dealing with a few people like that, I saw something else, which I used as my own personal sort of test. Whenever I saw a person who lied like that, and that I suspected had something more going on, and the meter would be flat, then I would pretend that I'm starting to buy their bullshit. I wouldn't reveal the fact that I have some sort of additional evidence like documentation or recordings. And I would just invite them to just continue with the lies and just dig themselves deeper and deeper. And what I spotted was this exact blinkless stare and this exact self-satisfied smile. And I wasn't really aware why this happens at the time when I was inside. However, after leaving, I read several books from the area of criminal psychology, and I want to mention Robert Hare's book. It's something you can pick up without actually being a student of psychology. He writes in a very pop science way. He was a clinical psychologist who worked on convicts in Canada, mostly, including murderers and people who are in for high-profile financial crime. And he said that sociopaths are distinguished by the fact that they experience something he called duping delight. It is a phenomenon that get a kick out of fooling people. And the smarter the person they're trying to fool and the more difficult and desperate the situation, the more happy and glad they are to just go on with the lie and triumph over the investigator. Which is usually in contrast with the normal people who are just glad and relieved to get out. The normal people will not try to dig themselves a very deep grave. They will just tell the minimal lie they can and run away. The sociopath is so self-confident and so enamored with and so lacking fear that they will just happily go on and dig a very deep grave just to score some of that "hey, I fooled you" moments. And this is how you can detect them. Why do I want to bring this up at a green tape? Well, because that's exactly the opposite of what Hubbard said. And the reason is that Hubbard was never an investigator. He was never testing his own technology, quote-unquote technology, on the people that he suspected of wrongdoing. And he never worked with actual evidence and documentation like we did. So he wasn't putting the work in his own methods. And he never discovered this very simple fact. So, I think that would be all. And let's consider this part 2 of the meter and interrogation series. If I will come up with some additional interesting topics that would be relevant to the area of investigations and interrogation, I will most likely do a next recording. If you have any suggestions, questions, especially when it comes to interrogations and ethics, please leave a comment and I will see if I can answer. So, thanks everyone and have a great evening.